The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.
I have been involved in cases where agents have registered companies in Companies House in the UK. Then when you go to the Companies House register, you find, one of the directors, this was a real case. We traced her. She was actually a cleaning lady in Panama. That was a registered director. The company hadn't done the diligence, but, the company was set up in her name, effectively.
Money make a world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. Article 6 of the Human Rights Act 1998 states that everyone has the right to a fair trial. That includes alleged shady oligarchs, bribers, money launderers, sanctioned evaders, and dodgy dealers. So, who represents them?
I had a good job until my boss accused me of stealing. I Better Call Saul!
You might imagine a Better Call Saul style situation, but your perception might be wrong. I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are discussing what you don't know about defending suspects of financial crime. We'll be discussing what defending white-collar crime looks like from a due diligence to going to trial, the most common causes of financial crime today, and the growing divide in sanctions between the US and EU. And to dive into this topic, I'm here with Paul Felberg, partner and head of white-collar defense at Brown Rudnick. Welcome to The Laundry, Paul. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I'm very happy to talk about pretty much anything you would like to talk about.
When we connected on LinkedIn, I was like, we've never had this perspective on the show before. Someone who's actually defending the financial criminals, because we've been covering most, on the other side, those who are trying to catch them or uncover them. But it will be interesting to dive into this topic. But before we go into the conversation, can't you tell our listeners a bit about you, your background, and about Brown Rudnick?
Yeah, of course. So I qualified in England as a barrister, so I would appear in court every day representing individuals. We still wear the wigs and the gowns, so I've still got those, although I haven't been in court for quite a long time. But my background really was in defence work, although in England you can also prosecute and defend if you're in a barrister's chambers. So I did prosecution work as well. And fairly soon, I think 3 or 4 years into my career, I started working for the UK government, Customs and Excise. So I investigated and prosecuted money laundering, fraud, corruption, smuggling, etc. So that was quite an interesting kind of grounding. So that was for what we call Customs and Excise. I then moved into the UK Serious Fraud Office as a senior prosecutor investigating and prosecuting corruption. And I investigated a number of fairly high-profile cases, including BA Systems, who were alleged to have bribed Saudi officials to buy UK weapons. But that is ancient history. I then moved out of the public sector into the private sector. And for over 10 years, I've worked in US law firms that have offices in the UK or in Europe. And the firm I work in the moment, Brown Rudnick, we specialize in what is called white-collar defense.
Yeah, what is white-collar defense? What's your definition of that?
I guess it's defending individuals and companies where they've been alleged to have been involved in what they call white-collar crimes. So I guess the phrase comes from, the collar of your shirt and whether or not you were an office worker or whether or not you were a factory worker. And I guess the office workers used to have white collars. So it tends to be about, corporate business. So insider trading, corruption for corporates, bribery, etc. So it's that type of thing rather than murders or burglaries, etc. So it's more like that.
And we got to dive into the clientele that you have, the customers that you serve. And I appreciate that you might not be able to reveal everything, but what type of businesses or companies or people is it that most normally come to you? Could you say anything about that?
It's a mixture. Some lawyers in my position will defend individuals mainly, and some will defend or advise corporations. I do both. For example, I may represent a banker or a trader who is alleged to have been involved in, for example, insider trading. So they got information they should not have got, and they decided to use that inside information to make money. Or, for example, an individual, for example, a CEO or CFO who has been misusing company funds, and they've decided to, buy themselves a car or go on holiday with company money, that kind of thing. So that's on the individual side. On the corporate side, I do a mixture of stuff. So it's advising companies on their compliance program. So that's one aspect of it. So how do you stop your company being used to launder the proceeds of crime? What systems do you put in place? How do you stop your agents, your third parties bribing on your behalf as a corporate? When you're a corporate, you have companies all over the world, they use third parties and they win business. So how do you stop that? And then if things go wrong, that's also where we come in. So and this happens quite a lot, a whistleblower will make an allegation to the company hotline or another way. I will say, look, I have a suspicion that there's something wrong. Something's going wrong here. So the company, if it's operating properly, will then look at that and they'll do an investigation. Sometimes they bring me in for that. Sometimes they do it themselves. But if it gets to the point where they suspect that a criminal offence may have been committed, they will often bring me in to advise on how they deal with that.
So it's quite a big aspect of different cases. But I mean, this show is called The Laundry, and we got to ask, have you ever defended any alleged money launderers?
Yes.
Is there any cases? Is there any, can you say anything about the kind of type of money laundering? What kind of sectors? Is it businesses? Is it individuals?
So under English law anyway, and I think in Europe as well, you can launder money if you're dealing with moving or somehow using funds which you think are the proceeds of criminal conduct, wherever that conduct took place in the world. So it's a really broad definition. And, the obvious examples are bags of cash. Someone gives you £50,000 of cash. That doesn't really happen that much anymore in my experience. People don't use cash. But what they do use is they use various shell companies to disguise source of funds, source of wealth, payments, etc. So we look at that quite a lot. In terms of people I've represented, it's mainly, this is not very interesting, but it's mainly corporates who have found themselves. So for example, if you have a corrupt contract, if a company wins a very substantial contract to supply government with whatever, say fighter jets, if that contract is corrupt, all the money that company then earns as a result of that is potentially dirty money. So they're involved in money laundering unless they make a filing with the relevant authorities. So it tends, in my experience, it tends not to be bags of cash, but more the proceeds of improper activity. We also have to be careful when we onboard clients as well.
Yeah, because I was wondering, when you onboard clients, how rigorous is your due diligence? Is it, do you take on anyone or?
I'd like to say it's very good. So we are obviously concerned about helping people launder money or using us as a route to clean their money effectively. So we do fairly strict checks on how we're being paid, basically. And if we've got concerns about how we're being paid, we won't take the client on. So yeah, the lawyers in the UK are under scrutiny. We have a lot of KYC regulations, so there are requirements we have to comply with. Interestingly, I was working in Switzerland recently, and I was told that the lawyers out there don't have KYC requirements. There's no regulation.
I don't know if you've heard, but the FATF is threatening to put Australia as well on the grey list because a lot of the lawyers, legal auditors, etc., are not subject to AML legislation. But that is now coming in there for full. But your due diligence, do you think if a bank with, let's say, 100,000 corporate clients or 200,000 corporate clients, would they be able to do the same kind of due diligence regime that you do on their clients? Or do you guys do it really time consuming manual to make sure that you are not being used?
No, I don't think so. And I've done work for banks and they have their kind of AML KYC program. And again, not super fascinating, but it's risk based. It's source of wealth, source of funds, where's the money coming from? Where is the individual coming from? Where is the corporate base? So, the higher the risk, the more diligence you do. And I think, banks have a tough time and the regulation is cumbersome and difficult. I mean, the other thing that's happened recently because of all the sanctions is that if you have a sanctions breach, then in theory, any kind of funds that have been created as a result of a sanctions breach are dirty money as well. So, and we have lots of reporting obligations in the UK. So lawyers have to report if I think I'm sitting on dirty money, unless it's privileged, legally privileged, and banks have a duty to report as well. And as you know, we make lots of suspicious activity reports. Whether or not anyone ever reads them, who knows? But we do file them.
And also, I got to ask, what was the last time you declined taking on a client, and what was the red flag that popped up in the customer due diligence that made you think like, I think not?
It was about 6 weeks ago, and the source of funds, we kept on asking questions and we kept on getting kind of different answers as to where the money was coming from. And we were not satisfied ourselves that we were being given a clear picture as to what was going on. So it was more kind of ambiguity about source of funds.
And where did you suspect that the source of funds came from?
We actually didn't know, but we've got a fairly low tolerance for risk when it comes to kind of onboarding clients. Having said that, there's an interesting provision in English law which has gone through the courts recently that basically says that if you as lawyers, well, it applies to everybody actually, but if you receive dirty money, even if you know or suspect the money is dirty, if you provide what they call adequate consideration in return, i.e. I provide a service in return for the money, then you can use the money, which is, I don't think they have that in other countries. But the origin of the law was a shop owner who'd received dirty money, but actually had provided some goods in return. And the shop owner didn't know the money was dirty, but he'd provided goods. Why should he be prosecuted for money laundering? So we are kind of looking at that. That's going through the courts at the moment, but that's maybe a bit niche kind of legal area.
Before we move on to sanction, because we need to talk more about that, I was wondering, since you guys, you do defend a lot of people alleged for a high white-collar crime, are there any like new trends that you see in, let's say, the money laundering sphere? Are there any new techniques that you've seen popped up, or any new ways that people are now trying to fuel money through the system? I
mean, I guess everybody's talking about crypto, which is a way, obviously, it's a kind of relatively good way to move money around. So people are defrauded of crypto, and crypto, there are some law firms that will take payments of crypto. We don't take payments of crypto yet, as far as I know. As far as moving money around, I don't think so. I mean, there's still the use of shell companies, trusts, kind of using the old, British Virgin Islands or some of those jurisdictions to move money around and disguise the original source of funds. So I haven't seen anything particularly new apart from crypto.
The good old complex ownership structure, offshoring shell companies. Have you seen, you mentioned crypto, but has there been other kind of how money laundering and fraud has evolved in the time that you've been working in the sector? I mean, it's, of course, the digitalization and fraud has evolved massively the last couple of years, but are there any other big trends that you've seen?
I mean, I think things have got better rather than worse, in the sense of, I think it is more difficult to move money around the world quickly without the relevant kind of checks and balances. I think a lot of in English, we call it the offshore jurisdictions, like the old Channel Islands, so Guernsey, Jersey, British Virgin Islands, Cayman. So these are areas that used to be hubs for, they weren't like me for saying this, but that's where money would turn up, because there was very little in terms of regulation. But I actually think those offshore centres have got much better, and they've, I'm sure you know about this. There's what they call the money val assessments. There's FATFA reports. I think there's some way to go, but I don't think those places are used to the same extent as they were previously in relation to money laundering. I think they've got better. So I think things are getting better rather than worse. But I have been involved in cases where agents have registered companies in Companies House in the UK, and those companies have been used by large corporations. And then when you go to the Companies House register, you find, one of the directors, this was a real case. We traced her. She was actually a cleaning lady in Panama. That was a registered director. The company hadn't done the diligence, but, the company was set up in her name effectively. So it's still super easy to do that stuff. It's getting better in the UK, but it's fairly easy to register a company and then use it effectively without, that much being seen about it.
Okay, we'll be right back to talk about the sanction space and white-collar defense. Don't go anywhere. Strise turns KYB from a costly burden into an automated winner. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what one of Europe's largest payment companies, Vipps Mobile Pay, has to say.
In the olden days, there were people sitting there Googling the company name, all the brand names, the CEO and so on. I think they used more effort into the process than evaluating the outcome, and that's what I'm looking for. I would say Strise definitely helped us improve our productivity. So working more efficiently, working more risk-based, automating repetitive processes, and by this helping us, of course, to decrease costs, but also improve customer satisfaction. Being able to make low-risk decisions automated without long waiting times, that's of course extremely important. Strise, one tool that works in all our markets, that we are able to collaborate, to have streamlined processes, to have optimized processes, to have one tool, one source of truth that is collecting all the input from a lot of other sources, so you don't need to open 3 different tools, but everything consolidated one place. Either you are part of the scalable automation game and work risk-based as everyone else, or you will not survive the competition. Strise is really helping us realizing those ambitions and goals.
Explore the AML Automation Cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. Okay, having looked more broadly at white-collar defense, let's really drill down into the sanctions element. Because on your profile, you mentioned that you also guide international companies on its Russian operations following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So who is reaching out to you about that? Who's requiring these services? Companies who want to find an easy way to get out of Russia, or companies who still want to do business in Russia and need to make sure that they are not hit by the legislation?
Now, there aren't that many companies left in Russia that we represent or have represented. But in 2022, 2023, we did a lot of work for companies that had operations in Russia and were trying to get out in a compliant way, which was hard, really hard.
What was the challenging part of it, and how were you able to, what kind of advice did you give in order for them to go out of Russia in a legal way?
The challenge is, by way of example, you've got an operation in Russia. All the banks that you pay your employees through are blocked. They're sanctioned. So how do you pay your employees? That's one problem. The phone bills, the phone company that they use for all their mobile phone is blocked. So how do you, as a EU company, pay the bills? That's a problem. If you liquidate the company, how do you get assets out? Again, that's problematic. One of the other interesting, tricky areas was if you're advising a corporate that has people in Russia about compliance with EU, UK sanctions or US sanctions, you, the company, have to advise them that they should be compliant with those laws. But what was happening in Russia is they were getting visited by Russian officials who said to them, if you carry on trying to comply with laws in relation to sanctions from EU, UK, and US, you are going to get prosecuted, or we are going to take all your goods. So that was really tricky. And so how do you balance giving advice to your client to make sure they're compliant with the safety of people in Russia? And what a number of companies did was to basically what we call pull up the drawbridge. So we are effectively separating ourselves from you as an organization in Russia. We will not give you advice. You will do your own thing. Don't call us. We will call you in 6 months and see how things are going. So that was tricky. But then also what happened and has been happening is Russia would appropriate companies' assets. So if they were left large, valuable pieces of machinery or stocks, they were just taken by the Russian government. So it's been really tricky. I don't do that much of it anymore because there aren't that many companies left in Russia, although there are still some that operate there. But they want to stay there and they have found a way to operate legally, I assume.
Yeah, because there are like quite a few well-known companies who still operate there, like Alibaba, AstraZeneca, Emirates, China Eastern, Air Serbia. A lot of companies like that are also advertising their flights to Russia still. But as you said, it's a while now since the invasion, and a lot of companies have pulled out, and the sanctions just keep coming. I mean, there's just more and more and more. But from your perspective, who have been working on it, do you feel that sanctions are really working, or is it just now Russia could appropriate a lot of property and started up their own Starbucks copies? And I mean, we've all seen these like the videos online with these copycat businesses appearing. What's your perspective?
It's a really hard and good question. Are sanctions working? And lots of people cleverer than me have tried to answer it. If the purpose of sanctions is to change behavior, which in theory it is, then has Putin decided to come to the negotiating table because of sanctions? I don't think so. There was an interesting New York Times article which said the true test of whether sanctions have worked will be if Putin demands that they're lifted as part of his negotiations. And I think he has, in the last week or so, asked for certain sanctions to be lifted. So, but I see that more as a kind of another item on the negotiating table. I don't necessarily see it as the result of sanctions. So I don't know is the answer. I think the longer sanctions go on, the longer Russia will start to develop different payment systems, different trading routes, and will eventually kind of effectively cut itself off from the West. Maybe it has worked to some extent, but if the test is has it changed its behavior, I think probably not.
Yeah, time will tell. It will be very interesting to follow this development over the period to come. I just wanted to circle back again to these. What are people who work in businesses who suddenly face themselves like, oh, we have been hit with a sanction. What do we do now? What's the initial reaction when they found themselves in those kind of situations?
I mean, I don't really know because we've never actually acted for sanctioned people, although we did act for the son of someone who was in America, and the son wasn't sanctioned. This particular individual was studying at a US college, and everything got blocked, everything got frozen. They couldn't buy anything, even though he himself wasn't sanctioned and he had nothing to do with his parents' business at all. It's tough. I mean, I also am of the view, which again may not be particularly popular, that everybody has a right to legal representation and fair trial and due process. And even if someone is designated, they have the right to challenge that designation, and lawyers should be entitled to represent them in the courts. But the other side of sanctions is that a lot of Russian people have been discriminated against in terms of banking. They've been debanked. Banks take a very risk-averse approach, as you probably know, and individuals and entities that are not blocked are suddenly lost and can't do anything. So it's difficult. It's a challenging environment to work in, I think.
Was it a lot of businesses that you represented for whom sanctions was very much a new problem that they were facing, that they were just never thought they would be stuck in and didn't even know about?
Very much so. Yeah.
What was the initial reaction when they suddenly was faced with these types of challenges?
Total chaos. Some of them, because sanctions hadn't really been like in the world I work in, white collar crime. Really, quite a small percentage of the work that we all did. I mean, the sanctions that we dealt with related to Iran. They're related to Cuba, if you're American. There just wasn't a lot of work. And a lot of companies who were not in the regulated sector, i.e. who aren't, they're not banks, they're not financial institutions, haven't ever really had to think about sanctions. And I think that's one of the big changes over the last 3 or 4 years is that a lot of companies have massively resourced their sanctions teams. They just didn't have anyone, or they had someone that was doing it part-time, or someone did data privacy and they did a bit of sanctions on the side, or they did AML compliance and a bit of sanctions. So that was a massive change, I think, across Europe in relation to how they looked at the risk that they were dealing with.
And talking about Europe, how do you see Europe and US going forward in the context of, let's say, white-collar defense? Because now suddenly it seems like US companies are allowed to bribe overseas and all these things. How, from your perspective in the field you are working in, how do you see this developing?
So Trump has paused all corruption investigations. He's basically put a pause on it from the DOJ, Department of Justice. A lot of American companies work around the world. They'll be in Europe, they'll be in the UK. There aren't that many of them that are just in the US. So there are still laws in the EU. So the UK has Bribery Act, France has a similar act, Germany's bring these type of laws into force. So my view is I think a lot of the international companies will still maintain this kind of compliance awareness in relation to bribery, corruption, and money laundering. And Trump hopefully will only be there for 4 years. I say hopefully because he's trying to have a third term, which is not actually legal. So God knows what will happen if he tries to have a third term. But it will be interesting to see if Europe steps up. We've seen an agreement between the UK, Switzerland, and France in relation to tackling financial crime. So it will be interesting to see whether or not that has an impact. I mean, everybody has always been scared of the US in terms of corruption investigations, mainly because of the huge fines and enforcement. So whether or not EU, UK companies will still have the same regard for the US, I don't know. But I don't think we're going to see a whole scaling back of compliance. What will be interesting, though, is, as you may know, there's always a tension in companies between the MLRO, the compliance officer, and costs, and the CEO who says, actually, you know what? You don't need as much money. You don't need as many resources. Stop doing all your KYC checks. It's not as important. Our CEO is going to say, well, actually, you know what? This doesn't matter as much anymore. You compliance have less money. You have less resources. I don't care as much because we're not going to get enforced. So it'd be interesting to see if that happens.
Definitely one of the areas to follow in the time ahead. I mean, you started on, let's say, the good side, on the working for the government, trying to take down the fraudsters and the white-collar criminals. Now you're in the white-collar defense. But what gets you out of bed in the morning? Why work in white-collar defense?
So I find it interesting. There are cases where, so I guess two things. For individuals, if there has been a kind of, something's gone wrong in terms of, I think, the prosecution or the government has done something improper, or the charges are wrong. That is interesting, and that feels kind of valuable to do that, to kind of hold the government to account, to make sure they do things properly, because I also know how they should be doing things. So I find that quite interesting and valuable. Also, in terms of corporate work, it's very rare that I would represent a corporate that had done something pretty bad and was trying to cover it up. It doesn't happen very often in my experience.
When was the last time you saw a really shady corporation that had covered a lot up? When was the last time you represented one of those?
I actually got a new case last week. Can't say too much about it, but actually the company had been defrauded rather than the company being fraudulent, as in people have been stealing a lot of money from the company. But in terms of companies actually doing, it doesn't, and it's probably not that exciting. I don't see it that often. I mean, I see things going wrong in terms of individuals in tricky jurisdictions operating in an environment where there's a lot of pressure to either increase profits or to get the contract, to adopt local customs, to do things the way they do in a local country. So that still happens. And I think there's a certain naivety amongst some European companies that just because they're based in a nice European country, that everybody who operates for their company will act with integrity. That is not the case. It doesn't happen like that. I don't know if you've heard of the documentary in Denmark recently, The Black Swan.
Yeah, of course. Based in Norway, that one made its round. That one was a big shock, I think, for the general public. I think it was not if you work in financial crime prevention, you're like, oh yeah, this is old news. But I think for the general public, it was a big shock, and also the fact that you had recorded these people and these conversations, so it was brought to the surface in this light for the first time for many.
And what I found there was a company we did some work for in one of the Scandinavian countries. I won't name which one, but we talked about their compliance program. I said, well, what is your compliance program? Do you have a compliance officer? And they were operating all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, etc. So, how do you keep control of what's going on? And they said, oh, it's fine. We have a Swede or a Dane or a Norwegian person in India. So it's all fine. That was basically their compliance program, was having someone from a Scandinavian country in a high-risk country.
They are thinking like, oh, the Scandinavian culture about being transparent and open, and that would just trickle down into this particular person's behavior in India. Was that the thinking?
I think so. And yeah, but also, I hate to kind of burst myths, but just because someone's from Scandinavia doesn't necessarily mean they're entirely compliant, as you well know. So I think there's this naivety or belief or trust that, we had it in England as well. It's a really naive or kind of first world view of how we all operate, and it doesn't work like that.
It doesn't. Although, of course, as a Scandinavian, I would like to think that all Scandis are lawful abiding citizens, but we've had enough stories up here that I know that it isn't true, particularly in the money laundering sphere.
Well, you had Swedbank and then you had Danske Bank, so there's been a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
What is the worst bad guy that you have ever defended in the white-collar world? What was the case?
I think the worst has been someone who defrauded a company for over 4 years in terms of siphoning off money from the company, where she was a trusted advisor, a relatively senior individual, and they got found out eventually. Again, that's lack of controls on behalf of the company. Also the individual didn't really have a defense in that. There was very little I could do. All I could do was kind of mitigate what he had done, effectively. So that I would call just pure greed, as opposed to anything more sophisticated than that. But interesting that this, we now have an offence in the UK, a failure to prevent fraud as well as failure to prevent bribery. So if companies actually don't stop fraud happening, they're also likely to be kept prosecuted, not just the individuals. So that'll be interesting.
We are nearing the end of the episode, but before we end, I'm going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. So I'll say something and you say the first thing that comes to mind. Are you ready?
Yes.
Why does bribery, embezzlement, and money laundering happen?
People are greedy, people on the ground and government officials, and people are operating under pressure.
What would slow down white-collar crime tomorrow?
Pay public officials more and give enforcement agencies more resources.
Are we getting to see more or less sanctions in the next year?
Both. Maybe less from America, I think more from EU, UK, and it's going to get more complicated.
And how often would you say the bad guys get away with it?
That is tricky. Not often.
That's good news. That makes me optimistic. That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Paul, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your stories. Where can people find and connect with you?
At the Brown Rudnick website if you would like to get in touch.
Money makes the world go round.
And thanks to everyone who's listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog of more than 100 episodes and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell a colleague about it, give us a 5-star rating. It really helps people to find us. What subjects do you think you should be talking about? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. And even if you want to be a guest, please do reach out. We are always interested in connecting with people in the industry. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. Our engineer was Nicholas. And The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit Strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Yeah, money make a world go round.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.